So I am Tina Beard. I'm the owner of Tamarack Genealogy. I am also a librarian, just like Fiona. I'm a librarian at the Plainfield Public Library in Plainfield, Illinois, and I have been teaching genealogy classes for over 20 years. And this is one of my favorites. I absolutely love photos, and hopefully you're going to enjoy some of the photos that I'm going to share with you as well. So what we're going to talk about are some simple techniques on how to identify those photos that you've received in your collections over the years, where you might have an inkling, it might be dad's side or mom's side, you're not quite sure how you're connected. But we're going to walk through some observational techniques. We're going to talk about genealogical research in order to try to match places in people with your family tree. So I am going to turn my camera off so that you can see my full screen. I want you to enjoy these photos as much as I do. And then that way you don't see my little talking bobbing head in your upper right-hand corner. And then I'll turn my camera back on for questions and answers. But in the meantime, I am going to turn that off. I'm going to minimize this. So Grandma Nellie, who's Grandma Nellie? That is my grandmother. So this picture that you see on our screen here is my Grandma Nellie and my mom, Patsy. This is one of the only photos that I have of my grandmother. And even worse, it's the only photo that I have of my grandmother and my mother together. Because when my mother got married, my grandmother did not attend. And just through years, photos have gotten lost or damaged. So this is the only photo that I have of these two important women in my lives together. But when you look at this photo, there's a lot going on that you could use to help you start to identify who and when and where a particular photo might have been taken. So, for example, if you know anything about cars, and I'm going to talk about cars in just a second, if you recognize that make and model, then you know that that photo wouldn't have been taken before that make and model had come out. Or if it's a specific type of clothing or a certain hairstyle, right? You know that that certain hairstyle didn't exist before a certain date. So you can start to ballpark and put into eras or categories the photos that you have within your collections. But I always just love to show off and brag about my mom and my grandmother and my mother with her knobby knees. She's probably 3, maybe 4 years old in this particular photo. So it is also the youngest photo I have of my mother. So, as I was saying, when you're thinking about the photos you have in your collection, you're looking for these kind of broad categories to start, right? You're looking for things like, is this in the country or the city? Are these black and white photos or are these color photographs? Are these studio portraits or are these candid photos like what we see on the screen here? And that information, while it might seem inconsequential, can really help you start to understand what you're looking at because you might have a lot more candid photos in your collection than studio portraits. And the reason for that is over time, candid photography became more readily available and was a lot less expensive than it was to sit for an official studio portrait. Or you might be just the opposite. You might have more historical studio portraits, those very traditional, stand very still, don't blink your eyes type of photos, because they're commemorating events within your family, right? Marriages or deaths or family reunions. And you might not have a lot of candids because maybe they didn't own or couldn't afford to have their own camera and then develop film on top of that. So, understanding the types of photos in your collection can help you understand what their socioeconomic status is as well historically. So when you start looking at photos and you look a little deeper, we would say, okay, this is a black and white photo. I'm going to put it into the black and white category. But then I'm going to say, okay, well, this is in a city, obviously. I've got, a brick alleyway and I can see buildings in the background, right? I see telephone poles, so I know it's after telephones were readily available. I can look at the make and model of the truck that this young man is leaning against. I can see that he's in a work uniform with a work hat on, so he's probably a delivery driver of some kind. I'm going to look at the surround, the either the frame that the photo comes in or the photographer's mark or the markings that are on the photo itself. So I can see that these are developed by Elko. And I could look up Elko and see when they were in business and how long were they developing film. And all of that will start to narrow down a time frame and a location potentially. So I might start looking through my family tree and say, okay, well, who do I know in my family that, worked for a delivery company in a town or a city? You look at the photo and you think, okay, it's probably 1940s. And in fact, this is mid 1940s, post-war. So we're looking at 1946, 1947. That might have matched this description in that time period. And then I would look and see, are there any street signs in the background that I could use to help me? Are there business names on any of the signs or windows or anything else that I can see in the background? In this particular case, is there a license plate where I can zoom in and see the year of the license plate or at least the state to find out what state I'm looking at? So all of those are things that you can kind of use to your advantage. But we're going to dig even deeper than that as well. As I mentioned earlier, photographer's marks are a really important piece to that puzzle. So it's going to kind of let you know right away, okay, I'm looking at somebody who was in Milwaukee or somebody who was in, Morgantown or somebody who was in New York City. And then I'm going to look for the type of material that the photo is made out of. So if it's a tintype, it's a very specific window of time when tintype's photos were produced. Or carte de visites, those larger cabinet cards that people would have. Things like black and white salt prints, right? Those photos you would see from the 20s, 30s, 40s. Are they color photographs, which you wouldn't see until after the Second World War, right? So we're looking mostly at 60s, 70s, and 80s. So we're looking at the type of material. Is it a daguerreotype, a glass plate of some kind? And, there's a lot of different varieties of photography that you can then use to narrow down what era we're looking at when we look at these types of photos. I'm going to show you a few examples of those in just a few minutes. We're going to look at the style of clothing that people are wearing. So sorry, gentlemen, if we have any gentlemen on, men's fashions do not change anywhere near as rapidly as women's fashions do. And even the most frugal of women still might fall for a fad of some kind or another. So I always look for the photos where somebody's wearing a fad outfit or a fad hairstyle because it helps me narrow down even more the time period when something might have been taken based on whatever fad is going on in that era at that time. But you'll look at things like this. So I look at this photo and I can see that we have two gentlemen. It's a tintype, so there's no photographer's mark on it. So I can say, okay, well, tintypes were really popular in the States, right? So assuming that the photos I'm looking at are taken within the United States, are popular between 1850 and 1880. You'll find some earlier than that, mostly overseas. So in my families I'm researching, I've got tintypes that go as early as 1847. But most of the time you're looking at 1855 to 1880, sometimes a little later, sometimes a little earlier, but that's a good ballpark. So I'm going to say, okay, we're looking sometime between 1860 and 1880. What are they wearing? So I can see one gentleman is wearing a bowler hat, another one is wearing a straw boater hat. They're both wearing three-piece suits with jackets and vests. One of them is holding a cane, the other one has a pocket watch that's stretching from, his jacket to his vest. You're looking at the style and the width of the ties that they have, bow ties, bolero ties, wide neck, skinny neck ties, all have very specific time periods that you're looking at. You're looking at the elbows and the length of the sleeves. You're looking at the length of the pants and the width of the legs. All of those are features that'll kind of give you an idea of the era that you're looking at. And then on top of that, the last thing we're going to talk about towards the end of the night are going to be props and backgrounds. So the simpler the background, just a bare wall or just a sheet, right, is going to be early. As photography develops, you start getting more and more elaborate backgrounds. So in the 1870s into the 1880s, we start seeing really fanciful backgrounds where they're Roman ruins or they're jungles or they're things like this. So just by looking at this photo, I could kind of in my head say, okay, this photo's probably taken in the 1870s because of the elaborate background that they're standing in front of. but not late 1870s because of the fact that they're still standing on like a bearskin rug, right? There's not an elaborate carpet in front of them. So you're just kind of learning the nuances to how photography studios worked and the type of photos they were taking and the backgrounds that they were using. And you could do that in a couple of ways. You can do it by looking at your local historical society or by going online. I'll talk about that more towards the very end, looking at things like Shorpy or Library of Congress or some of these other places where they have a lot of photographs, Flickr. And I'm looking at eras, 1880s women's fashion, right? And it's going to show me a bunch of photos. Or, 1870s photography studios, and it's going to show me photos of photography studios. And you're just kind of filing that information away, like, oh, I've seen that background before. Or you're looking at photos that you have within your own collection. You're playing a game of matching. And we're going to do that at the very end. I'm going to show you an example of that where I'm looking for that same chair or that same background or that same tablecloth or that same prop from photo to photo to photo within my own family photos as well. So in regards to clothing styles, we kind of recognize, the biggies, right? We recognize 1860s, the tight button-down jackets and the big full skirts that you would see, the snoods and the curls that you would see on women during the 1860s. We kind of recognize that Gibson girl look in 1900 and 1910 with the really high tight collars, the white shirts with the big puffy sleeves. We kind of recognize that when we see it. Or the 1920s, your flapper looks, your straight skirts and your short hair and your long beaded strands. Or the 1960s, right? A-line dresses with beehives or bouffant hairs. We kind of recognize certain styles, but sometimes it's not always as easy as you think. So that's when you have to use a variety of different clues together to start to figure it out. So this particular photo is a good example of this. There's three pieces of information that I can use to start to ballpark an era on when this photo was taken. First, I can look at what the couple are wearing. So, she's wearing a big bow, with a jacket with, kind of flouncy sleeves, but she's wearing white shoes, white-heeled shoes. He's wearing a very dapper suit, right? Thin tie with white shoes also. White shoes are really indicative of the 30s and 40s. So that's kind of the general ballpark I'm going to be using. Then I'm going to look at the surround that the photo is within. And you can see that it has a very, Art Nouveau style to it. Again, that leans towards, late post First World War, pre-World War II. Right, so I'm starting to narrow my focus down. And then at the very bottom, it says Gottfried Studio, Aurora, Illinois. So then I'm going to go and look up Gottfried Studio and see if Gottfried Studio was even in business in the in-between era between the First World War and the Second World War. So if I didn't know who this couple was, I could ask myself, okay, who would be getting a studio portrait in my family within this era? It almost looks like they're at a movie theater. Like it almost looks like a curtain for a movie theater behind them. So I'm going to see, okay, well, she looks like maybe she's in her late 20s, early 30s. He looks like he's in his mid 30s. Who in my family might meet that description that would have had a photo taken in Aurora, Illinois at this particular time? And you know what? You might not have an answer yet. And that is perfectly fine. But then at least we've got a ballpark, we've got an era, we've got an era and a location. So we can set that aside until we maybe find other photos of this couple that are identified or other photos from that studio that we do recognize already. And then that's going to help lead us potentially to an answer. One of the greatest things when dealing with photography and photography studios is during the Civil War, for a very defined period in the North, the federal government created the IRS, and they created the IRS and they were issuing what are called tax stamps on luxury goods. So from 1863 until August of 1865, the federal government, the U.S. government, we're not talking about Confederacy, we're not talking about Confederate states, we're just talking about the remaining United States, was taxing luxury goods in order to pay for the Union war effort. So if you are lucky enough in your family that you have a photo that has a tax stamp on it, you know you are looking at a photo that was taken between January of 1863 and August of 1865. They did not start issuing these before January of 1863, and very few places were still issuing them after August of 1865. So I have a really tight window there of 2 years, right? 18 months, that if I don't know who this person is, I at least have a time frame from which to work. So I actually have three different copies of this photo because three different branches of the family had the exact same photo. Nobody knew who this woman was because in the two other branches of the family, they just had it as a loose photo. It was not in an album, and the back of the photo did not have a name on it. It wasn't until we discovered, once we took the photos out of the third family member's photo album, that we found the tax stamp and the fact that it had her name on the back of it. What's remarkable about this photo is that Jeanette Small Burkett was the um, second wife of a man, Daniel Burkett. They were only married for 17 months. They had gotten married, they had a child. A few months later, she got pregnant again, had the baby, and died within the month after the second child was born. That second child was born in the spring of 1865. You can look, when you look at this photo, you can almost kind of imagine that she's pregnant when this photo is taken, because if you notice, her jacket's not quite as snug and her skirt sits up higher than it normally would have if she was, not pregnant. So, in our mind, we're thinking this photo is taken just before she passes. And the fact that it has the tax stamp on it tells us that it's taken sometime between 1863 and 1865. So it was a remarkable find, one, that it had the tax stamp on it, and two, that it actually had her name on it. So if you're lucky enough, that can really help you narrow down your research. Now, here's the caveat to this. These tax stamps were issued for luxury goods. So that would include jewelry, that would include real estate, that would include carriages and wagons or fancy clothing. So if somebody was purchasing an entire album, let's say, they wouldn't have to put a tax stamp on the back of each one. They would only put a tax stamp on the back of one of them within the album. So it's kind of a luck of the draw, right? That you find the one in the album that received the tax stamp. If the photo album's disassembled, right, and all the photos are scattered, you have no idea that they all are at the same age because you don't have the tax stamp to go along with it. But the tax stamp could be anywhere from 1 cent to 5 cent, depending on the cost of what the object was. So if you're buying a carriage or property, it's most likely going to be a 5 cent stamp. And it's based on the amount of money you would spend. So if you bought an album that had 8 photos or 12 photos in it, you might only pay 1 to 2 cents. If you're buying an album that has 24 or 36 photos in it, you might be paying 3 cents in tax. So it all is based on how much you spent in total, not how much you're spending on each individual piece. So sometimes they're hard to find, but when you come across them, they can be exceptionally useful in your research as well. So if I were to look at that photo, I'd be like, oh, that's a studio portrait of a woman, right? And I might not think anything of it. But there's a process called active seeing that I want you to add into your repertoire as you're looking at old photos, and even just kind of as you're working on your genealogy kind of as a whole. And active seeing involves reciting out loud what it is you see in a particular photograph. And here's why you recite it out loud. If you glance at a photo and in your head you're like, oh, she's wearing a, button-down jacket and a large skirt and she's standing in front of what looks like a Gothic style chair, right? If you're just saying that in your head, you're not really retaining any of that information. But when you recite something out loud, your brain activates and you start remembering or pulling out details to things that you wouldn't necessarily see if you just looked at a photo and in your head said what it was you saw. So what you're looking for is, well, what type of print do I have, right? Is it a carte visite? Is it a black and white salt print? Is it a color photograph? Is it a daguerreotype or an embryotype? Okay, so what type of print do we have? What is its condition? If it's a daguerreotype, does it have fog under the glass? Or does it have mold or mildew on it as a cabinet card? Does it have a tear in it or water damage in some way? Right? Because that's going to kind of describe where it's been living, right? What kind of conditions it's been exposed to over the years. Tin types, right? They might be all scratched up and dented and bent, right? Tells you the type of life it's been leading. So what type of photo is it? Is it a studio portrait, a very official portrait like the one we just saw for Jeanette? Or is it a candid photo like we saw of the young man kind of casually leaning against his work truck? What do we see in the background? Oh, I see a farm, right? I see barns or chickens or something in the background. Or I see a theater, or I see, just a wall because it's a studio portrait and there's not a background to it. How many people are in the photo? And say these out loud. I have 6 people in this photo. I have 2 men and 4 women, or I have a man and a woman and 3 children, or I have, 2 women that look like sisters, right? You're saying these things out loud. And then you're going even deeper. Okay, what are they wearing? They're wearing casual clothes, or they're wearing work outfits, or they're wearing a wedding dress and a suit, or, they're wearing winter jackets, right? You're saying out loud what it is you're seeing. And then you're associating general ages with these photographs. Okay, well, I have a man and a woman. We might assume they're husband and wife with 3 children. Okay, the man looks like he's in his 50s. The woman looks like she's in her 40s or in her 50s. The children look like they're roughly school aged, right? Or they're teenagers or they're infants. And the reason you say this out loud is because you might start to recognize what family that is just by saying it out loud. And by saying it out loud, then you're starting to look for more details. Do they have wedding rings? Are they wearing a piece of jewelry that you recognize? Are they wearing an outfit that you've seen in another photo? Right? So by saying it out loud, it helps you start to pull out these details that you might not have seen if you just look at the photo. So here's an example. We're going to play a little game. So I want you to take a look at this photo. And I'm going to give you, we'll say 30 seconds to take a look at this photo. And I want you to think about everything that you're seeing in this image, right? Are we talking about city or country? Are we talking about 21st century or 20th century or 18th, 19th century? Are we looking at a small town or big city, right? Are we looking at spring, summer, fall, or winter? Right, so look at the details in this photo. And I'm going to come away from it in just a minute, but I want you to kind of take a look at it. All right, everybody ready? Okay, I'm going to back up one. So what do we see in the photo? We see a young man who's sitting in a vehicle that looks to be a work vehicle. Do you remember the name of the vehicle? Do you remember what kind of style the vehicle was? What did the tires look like? What time of year was it in the photo? And why? What would give away the time of year that we were looking at in the photo? Was there anything in the background? Could you read any of the business names? Could you read the addresses of those businesses? Right? What was the street made out of? What were the buildings constructed out of? So now let's go back to it and take a look at it again. So we see he's driving what's called Johnson Oils, right? We could see that it's a work truck, right? And it's got a tank in the back of it. It has pneumatic tires, right? So we know that this is probably really early on, probably in the teens or the 20s, because in the 1930s they switched to radial tires, right? Different style of tires. These are more like bicycle tires. We see that he's wearing gloves and a hat, so it's probably still chilly. He looks like he's either wearing a jacket or a jumper, right, with a collar. But if you look in the background, Albert's store is a haberdashery. So we have a hat shop behind him, a jewelry store, Star Jewelry is behind them. We can see that there's a radio and supply store as well, and what looks like either a photography studio or maybe a calendar shop off to the far right side. Gives me their addresses as well. right? So I can see the addresses of the business and I can look them up in Google or in newspapers or in city directories to find out where this is. But the hats in the store window tell me what time of year it is because they're straw boater hats. And you're not going to be putting straw boater hats in the window for sale unless it's late winter, early spring, and you're getting ready for the next season of dress. You wouldn't put straw boater hats in the window for Thanksgiving or Christmas. You're going to do that for the spring. So I have a general idea that this photo's taken in late winter, early spring, sometime probably in the 1920s. So upon further investigation, this is the city of Joliet in Illinois. This is Arthur Nichols. We'll see Arthur again in another occupation a little later on. Um, and this was the company that he worked for as a young man. And you would do that no matter what the photo was that you were looking at. So this one comes out of an album. The person who owned the album labeled this the EJ&E Car Service Depot, which is our local Elgin, Joliet, and Eastern Railroad. You can see everybody's at their desks. You can look at the dress clothes they're wearing. You could look at the women's hairstyles. The description above says 1927, so you could match that up with those kind of pin curl, short flapper style hairstyles that you see there. You could look at the equipment that they're using to get that feel. But what I love the most about this particular photo is that in the back of the room, I can see the time on the clock and the date on the calendar. So the calendar says that this photo was taken in October of 1926 and that the clock says that it's just shy of 3 p.m. in the afternoon. Now, it might have been developed and she might have added it to her album in 1927. But unless they forgot to change the calendar for several months, the calendar says that it's October of 1926. And what I love even more is on the back of this photo, she wrote every single person's name onto the back of the photo. The downside to that photo is then she rubber cemented it into the album, so I can only see some of the names listed without damaging the album to take it apart to get the names off the back of it. So sometimes you're lucky you have names, but sometimes those names come with a huge caveat. So let's talk about eras in photography. So I talked a little bit about tintypes. Tintypes typically you're going to find between roughly 1860 and 1880. Like I said, you can find them as early as 1850. You can find them as late as 1885 to 1890. But the bulk of them exist between 1860 and 1880. So when you have such a huge window of when these photos were popular, then you have to look at some of those details, like I mentioned, about backgrounds. And if you're lucky enough that there's still a wrapper with a photographer's mark on it to use in your research. So when I look at these three photos, I can see that the two men on the left have the exact same background as the two women on the right. So while these came from two different families and they are not related to each other, they did come from the same photo studio in the same community. So I'm lucky enough to know that these photos are taken at the same studio because they're both using the same background. And I'm looking at other features. So on the far left, these two gentlemen, they're most likely brothers. They look very much alike. So if not brothers, they're probably cousins of some kind. I would look at how old they are. They look like they're in their, early 20s, late teens, early 20s. I'm looking at their clothing styles, right? The bow tie and the tie that the gentleman standing is wearing. And I'm looking at this chair. So I'm going to come back to this chair a little later on because I call it the ubiquitous chair. It's in every photo studio all around the world for about a decade. So we see this photo in photos from the mid 1860s all the way into the 1880s, unfortunately. It's a terrible example of narrowing down a time period. But at least if I spot that chair, again, it's fitting into that same window. If we look at the photo of the woman in the center, you notice she doesn't really have a background. So this photo is probably taken, it's probably slightly earlier than the other two photos. The other two photos I would probably say were in the 1870s because of that elaborate background and because of the chair that the gentleman is sitting in. But I don't have an exact date. But this one, She's wearing, if you look at it, she's wearing a crepe dress. See how it kind of looks like a little wrinkly and a little scratchy? See how it has that pleating right underneath her collar? This is a morning dress. Crepe was something during the Victorian era that women would wear when they were in mourning. So this young lady is wearing a crepe dress in mourning for somebody who died close to her. Could be a sibling, could be a brother, could be a parent. We don't know. But I'm going to ask myself, when could this photo have been taken? Again, we're in that window 1860 to 1885, 1880. But I'm looking at the pleating in her dress, which tells me it's probably early 1870s. I'll talk more about that in just a minute. I'm looking at the hairpin that she has in her hair. I'm looking at the style of hair that she has, just pulled tight without any bangs. Bangs became a thing right about 1872, so we're probably looking at a photo that's taken before 1872 because of the pleating and because she doesn't have any bangs. But if you look at this photo, look at her eyes. It doesn't look like that her eyes are focused, that she's looking in the same direction. It doesn't look like her eyes are focused on any particular thing. And this was a photo that was given to me from a family member. And when I brought it to her attention and I said, this looks odd. Her eyes don't seem to be looking in the same direction at the same time. My patron's eyes lit up and she says, I know who this is. And I was like, oh, well, then you have to fill me in. And she says, this is Emma French. She said, she's blind. And as soon as she said it, it made perfect sense to me. Um, One of her ancestors, Emma French, was indeed blind, had spent time in the Illinois School for the Blind in Jacksonville, Illinois. She shows up in the 1870 census as being at the Jacksonville School for the Blind, and her father had passed away in that time period. So just by looking at her eyes, we were able to figure out exactly who the person was in this photo based on what she was wearing, based on the simplicity of the background, and the fact that she was vision impaired. Now, you might not get that lucky. That was kind of a one in a million, in my opinion. Here's another era of photos. If you're lucky enough to have diamond photos in your collection, these were kind of a fad in the late 19th century, between 1880 and 1900. You'll see a lot of these that were produced. And basically, they're just squares where the photo was developed on an angle to create a diamond. There's another fad, two fads I want to talk about here. So besides just the diamond photos, which again gives me a very specific decade in which I'm searching. If you look at the collars that the women are wearing, the one on the top left almost looks like, she's in the circus, right? It's very Shakespearean, their collars, right? They're really tight around the throat and they kind of have a lot of pleating and decoration on them. That was really, really popular in the 1890s as well. Those kind of flamboyant collars. As the decade progressed, as we got to 1900 and the aughts, those collars came all the way up to the chin. So these tell me that these are early 1890s because the collar hasn't risen all the way up to their chin yet. But the dead giveaway is the top knot that both of these women have. So if you look at the top of their head, it almost looks like just that. You take your hair and tie it in a knot. And top knots were notoriously popular between 1894 and 1893 and 1896. So again, I've narrowed this photo down even more because of the top knot, that fad, that very short-lived fad that these women had succumbed to, if you want to think of it that way. So the diamond of the photo, the kind of Shakespearean collars, low collars that they're wearing, and those top knots help me put these photos between 1893 and 1895. I'll come back to another photo again, and we'll point out the top knot. Another set of photos that you probably have in your collection are those really long rectangular portraits that were typically 3 by 11 or 3 by 8. These studio portraits were, as you can see, these are senior class photos. These are our graduation photos, so to speak. These are the photos that would have gone into the local yearbook. And what I'm blessed with on 2 of the 3 of these photos is that they actually put the emblem to the 2 schools right into the photograph. So they're all done at the same studio. They're all done at Harrington. You can all see the little squiggle off to the left. That was the mark of Harrington. But on the bottom left, I can see that it says JHS, Joliet High School. And on the right, it says Plainfield. So I know I can start looking through yearbooks between 1910 and 1920, roughly, maybe to 25, but typically to the end of the First World War, and see if I can identify who these students are. Same thing would be true with class photos. So if your high school didn't have a yearbook that was physically printed in that era, but they had class photos, I would be looking for these exact same images in a class photo of maybe 5 or 10 or 25 students. And usually the name would be on the class photo. So I know who all of these are. I've got Ross Burkett on the left. You'll see a picture of him again in just a minute. I've got Clinton King in the center. You'll see a picture of Clinton King again. And then Ross's cousin in the photo on the right. But those photos were really, really popular in the teens. So if you have one of those really long, narrow photos, you can start with 1915 as your center point and work forwards or backwards a few years in either direction until you can find the specific date of that particular student's senior year. Photo postcards are ubiquitous. We all have these in our collection. There are a dime a dozen. You can find them at every antique store, estate sale, flea market, wherever you happen to be. These are kind of everywhere at any point. The beauty of picture postcards are that sometimes they were mailed. And if you're lucky enough to have them mailed, it has the to and the from. So you have the address of where it's coming from and where it's going. You have the date and the time that it was mailed. So it tells you the city in which it was mailed and the exact date in which it was sent. So the photo on the right, again, here's a picture of Ross Burkett, who we just saw as a senior standing in the center with his family members. Um, and on the back, this postcard was mailed to somebody in the family. And on the back of it, it has the age of all three, their names and all three of their ages. And then in the upper corner where the seal is, it was stamped and mailed from Plainfield, Illinois, and tells me it was mailed September 8th, 1908. Great information to have because now I have the date, I have the children's ages, and I have the location. So then I would start doing a Google Street View to try to find this house to see if I can identify it if it still exists to figure out exactly what this address is. Now, this photo in the upper left, this one of Lila Carnegie, she's a beautiful little girl, isn't she? There's not really a lot that it wasn't mailed. There's no date on it. All I have is her name. But I do have some important features that kind of give me a ballpark in which to work from. So in the aughts, right, between 1900 and 1910, that era are called the aughts. Most young girls would typically wear very simple frock dresses and black tights. If you were old enough, you would have a bow in your hair. In this case, Lila's too young. She doesn't have enough hair to have a bow yet, but she's still wearing the black tights and the frock dress. So I know that this is sometime between 1900 and 1910. Another piece to the puzzle is the chair in which she's sitting. I'll show you another example of one of these chairs a little bit later on. But those wrought iron heart-shaped chairs that you would typically see in like soda fountains, this little chair is what she's sitting on. So looking at that chair, which was really popular right around the turn of the century, coupled with her white dress and her black tights, all tell me that this photo was taken sometime between, let's say, 1900 and 1904. So then I would look Lila up in the census and see if there's an age that's given that might help me. So she looks like she's about 18 months to 2 years old in this photo. So based on what I can find in the census between 1900 and 1910, it's going to help me extrapolate, okay, how old would she have been? What year would she have been 2 years old? And I would use that to my advantage. Now, photo postcards are really, really popular. They still make them today, but their heyday, their most prolific era would be roughly between 1905 and 1915. But again, you're going to see them 1900 into the 1920s. But if I have these in my collection, I'm really starting with like 1905 to 1910, and then I'm working from there if there's no postage mark on it. At a glance, you kind of get this. You feel that this is post-war 1940s and 1950s. But there's a few things that give these away. One is going to be the Art Deco revival enclosures that all of these are in, right? They're just kind of like those linen covers on a cardboard back where you would slide or glue your photo into place, and these would have sat on top of a mantle or a piano or a fireplace or something else like that. We look at the soldier who's in the upper left-hand corner, right? If you look at the emblem on his hat, you can see that he's in the Marine Corps because you can see the eagle and the globe. If you look at the stripes on his uniform, you can decipher the three stripes to tell me that he's a sergeant in the Marine Corps. This could be Second World War. This could be Korean War. We don't quite know yet, but I'm going to start asking myself who in the family was in the Marine Corps, who was a sergeant in the Marine Corps, either in the Second World War or Korea. I'm going to look at this young lady. She has a very loose blouse with flowers. Flowers are all the rage in the early 1940s to mid 1940s. I'm going to look at her hairstyle, right? I'm going to start to identify all of these pieces to start to put this together. And I'm going to look up Rant Studio and find out when Rant Studio was in business and where Rant Studio was in business. Now, this adorable little boy could be their son, and in fact, in this case, it is. But what we're looking at is the outfit that he's wearing. Military styling was very popular during any military engagement, whether that's Civil War, whether that's World War I, World War II, Korea, dressing little boys up in army style uniforms or Navy style jumpsuits was all the rage. So if you have a photo of a little boy who looks like he's in military garb, you're going to tie that back to what military engagement might be closest to this. So again, this could be Korea, this could be Second World War. But I'm going to take the frame, I'm going to take the clothing that he's wearing, and I'm going to start comparing it to what I know about my family. How about Polaroids, right? So these are my family. So my sister in the center, who just celebrated her 55th birthday this week, and then me in on the right-hand side. And I want to talk about the different eras to Polaroids because it's a really important thing to know. So Polaroids are not just a 1970s invention. Polaroid actually was developed before the Second World War, but it really came out into the public starting in 1948. And between 1948 and 1962, you would purchase the Polaroid camera and you would send your film directly back to Polaroid to be developed. And what you would get back would be these hard-backed photos, almost like cabinet cards, in black and white, that would have the Kodak logo on them and a date. From 1963 to the mid 1970s, you would get Polaroid photos that would have the date on them, but they were on a soft backing. So we look at the two that we see here, they're in color. These are our dogs when we were little, Christy, the mom, and Brutus, the puppy. It's a soft back. It's no longer on those hard backings that the first rendition of Polaroids were on, and these are in color. The last rendition, the ones that we typically think of with color Polaroids are those ones that, you hit the button and it gives you your photo and then you've got to shake it until the photo appears. And you can see in this photo of me, this is Easter 1978, you can see that the photo is starting to crack from age. With this era of Polaroids, when that image cracks, I'm going to lose that photo just because the gas inside is going to damage and eliminate the image. But on those earlier renditions of Polaroids, that was not the case. So we look at the photo of my sister and we can see this photo is clearly damaged, but we haven't lost the image like you would in modern Polaroids. And believe it or not, there's actually a fourth round of Polaroid. They kind of made a comeback to younger generations. My kids both got Polaroid cameras for Christmas a couple of years ago. Again, where, they're taking photos and they're developing them on the spot. So there's a new generation of Polaroids that are being developed. But I just wanted to point out the fact that there's three different eras of Polaroids that would have three different types of materials. So after 1963, you didn't necessarily need to send it back to Polaroid anymore. You could take it to a reputable dealer. But previous to that, you would have to put it in its envelope and send it back to them. So let's talk about those styles and those accessories. So again, we look at these two photos. The one on the left we can recognize as being Civil War era, right? We're looking at her hair being up in the hairnet. Again, really tight part down the middle, no bangs. We can see she's got that button down top, right? And the big flowy skirt. So we recognize that as being Civil War era. Again, it's a tintype, so that fits right into that time frame we're looking at. So I would start to look through my photos or look through my collection and see, okay, who do I have? What young ladies do I have? She looks like she's maybe early 20s to mid 20s, maybe even a little younger. Um, no wedding rings on her finger, so she's still single, that would fit into this era at this time. The one on the right-hand side, again, a lot more elaborate background. So, like I've been teaching you, 1870s, right? We're looking at those Roman ruins and those jungles and things like that. We've seen this background before, something very similar in the two tintypes that we saw with the two gentlemen and the two women. We can see there's a carpet kind of draped in the background. And again, that ubiquitous chair that we're going to see a lot in our photographs. But what gives this one away a little bit more is A, the bangs. Like I said, in the early 1880s, 1880s, 1871, 1872, bangs were all the rage. So you would cut your hair really short and then crimp it into bangs. And the pleating and the bustle. So we can see she has really tight pleating on her skirt, and we've got a big bustle in the back. That big bustle in the back with that pleating, again, kind of carrying over that militaristic style. You might see epaulets on women's jackets at that time. But those two things tell me that I'm looking at somewhere between, 1870 and 1873. So you're just trying to pull out those nuances. I love these two little boys. And if you look at these two photos, you might remember back in the day when people would talk about Little Lord Fauntleroy. And Little Lord Fauntleroy was a book that was published in the late 19th century. And this was the style of clothing that the boy is wearing, right? Those big flouncy collars, the big puffy sleeves with either the lace or the loose trim on them. Both of these boys are wearing that particular fashion. You see the boy on the right has really tight curls. Oh, that poor kid to have to sit with, and have his hair curled for this. But there's a couple of other props in here that kind of give away the era to these photos. So in the 1890s, before roads were being paved as part of the Lincoln Highway, there was a cry for improved roads through what's called the Good Roads movement. And the Good Roads movement was designed for people to have roads where they could ride bicycles. And not two-wheeled bicycles, but tricycles like this. So adults with their big tricycles, right? Those ones you had to climb up on with the big 6-foot wheel, or little tricycles for young children. Tricycles were all of the rage in the late 1890s. So looking at these two photos, I can see that this photo of this young boy on the left, at a glance, dressed like little Lord Fauntleroy, the elaborate background that he has behind him and the prop that he's holding tells me that this photo was most likely taken in the late 1890s, 1895, 96, 97. The photo on the right, I'm using the chair as the prop of the chair as kind of my linchpin to figure out when this was. So I'm going to go through furniture catalogs and see when this style of chair first appears. Like I mentioned with the uh, um, the soda fountain chairs, right? Those didn't start to come around until right around 1900. So if I see that in a photo, I know that I'm looking at a photo that's at least 1900 going forward. I'm not going to see it before that. So I'm going to use these prompts. Another thing to keep in mind when we're looking at photos of young boys is there were three eras to young men's dress. So when boys were infants before they were potty trained, they would still wear dresses. So they would wear gowns so that they would be easy to change. Once boys were potty trained, roughly 3 to 4 years old, they would start wearing, knickerbocker pants, short pants, and both of these boys are wearing short pants. It's harder to see on the left, but they're both wearing short pants. You would wear short pants until puberty, right? Until, bar mitzvah time or until communion time, right? About 11 or 12 years old, where you would then graduate to long pants. So when you're looking at family photos, you can use these snapshots of, are they wearing dresses? Are they wearing knickerbocker pants? Or are they wearing full length pants to kind of help you age how old the child is in the photo that you're looking at. So both of these children are probably 3 to 3.5. Maybe Walter on the right is 4 at the most, probably not. Um, to help you kind of narrow down, okay, who could this be in this window that could match this era? This little girl on the left, this photo just makes me cry laugh. So, remember what I told you about the aughts, right? That young ladies would wear kind of frock dresses and black tights and bows in their hair. So young girls would wear bows in their hair until they were of marrying age. So as soon as you had reached an age, 15, 16, 17, depending on where you are in the country, and you're eligible to be married, you'll no longer wear a bow in your hair. So these two young girls are still wearing bows in their hair. I can pinpoint this photo to the aughts based on the frock dress and the black tights that the eldest sister is wearing in this photo. Baby's too young for me to tell whether it's a girl or a boy, but we can see that they're wearing, a gown of some kind. But look at that baby stroller, right? That looks terribly safe. Photo on the right is taken in that same era. Remember, I talked about Gibson girls, right? Where, you'd have the puffy sleeves and the high white collars and the big, loose, messy buns that most of these women have in their photo. So again, this is a photo that's taken late 1910 to probably 1915, maybe a little earlier. They're wearing lockets, right? We're looking at these identifying features. 3 of the 5 of them are wearing lockets. If you look at the young lady on the far right, if you look closely, you can see she has glasses on, but side, no ear pieces to her glasses. They're just resting right on the brim of her nose. And I'm looking for wedding rings, and I can see a couple of these women have wedding rings on as well. So, okay, again, who would match that description? This is coming a little more recent. We look at the photo of the school children. We can see that it's cold out. They're wearing jackets and hats. The boys have newspaper, newsboy hats on. You can see the young ladies have, short, chin length hair. So this photo's taken in the 1920s, right? Again, they're still wearing those kind of house dresses, those frock dresses, but their hairstyles are what give it away, right? Again, don't know exactly what year in the 1920s, but we know this is taken sometime within the 1920s. That's based on the outfits that the boys and the girls are wearing. Now, this one on the left is a little harder, and I wouldn't expect you to necessarily get this, but once I start describing it to you, it's going to help you in your research. So these two women are sisters, and they're wearing jackets, but they're not wearing winter jackets. They're wearing driving coats. So this is after 1908, after the first automobile rolled off the line, but we don't know exactly when, not after 1908, until we start investigating a little further. So they both have driving gloves and driving jackets, right? They have mink stoles because they're well-to-do. But what gives away this photo are their hats. So we see the girl on the right still has a bow in her hair, so she's not old enough to get married. But the lady on the left does not have a bow, so she's older than the one on the right. But if you look at their hats and you see how their hats are just kind of balanced right on top of their head, the one looks like a Napoleonic era hat, right? 1914 is the centennial of the end of the War of 1812 and the Napoleonic Wars, right? So the Battle of Waterloo happens. Um, Napoleon is defeated. 1814, Battle of Borodino. I won't get into the facts there, but her hat is in that kind of French um, bicorn style, like Napoleon. And if you look through Milner catalogs or if you look through women's fashion catalogs in the 19 teens, this style of hat is all the rage. 1912, 13, 14. As the years progress throughout the decade, 1915, their hats rest a little lower. 1916, 1917, until 1918, when hats are resting right on your eyebrows. So hats kind of drop an inch from 1914 until 1918, when, again, just like a ball cap, it's resting right on your eyebrows. So I know looking at these two women's hats that this photo was taken right around 1914 because of where their hats are placed on their head. So I might not know who they are, but I know when the photo was taken because of the hats that they're wearing. And how do we find those? I'll tell you how to find those catalogs in just a minute. Here's another example. Again, here's our woman with our top knot. So we know this photo is taken right around 1895. You can see that mom is wearing a crepe style dress as well because you could tell from the material that she's wearing. It's got a high collar, so we've moved past 1895, right? Because lower collars at the start of 1890, higher collars by the end of that decade. So she's got a high collar on and the top knot. So we're probably leaning more towards 1895, 96 versus 1893 or 94. We can see that the boys both have a little pin on their collars. That's a photo of a baby. So my guess is this is a photo taken of a family who had lost a child. A baby had died. And in Eastern European culture, children would wear white for funerals instead of black. So that's why I believe the two children are in white. Mom is in her mourning dress, based on traditional Victorian customs. I don't know who this family is, but I can tell you that this photo is, a family who has lost a child sometime between 19 or 1895 and 1896, just based on what she's wearing. Here's another example of one. This beautiful young lady, again, is wearing a piece of jewelry. That's the photo of a loved one that died. So that could be a spouse, that could be a fiance, it could be a brother. What we can tell is that it's a young man, but we don't know what her relation is to the young man. She does not necessarily look like she's wearing crepe, although it's hard to tell in the photo, but you could see she does still have that really high collar. So this photo might be taken after 1900. When that's still a popular fad. But again, I'm not quite sure who she is. I can just ballpark it to an era in when Pratt Studio is in business. Just a couple of more. We're going to look at props in these particular photos. So again, here's that chair, the soda fountain style chair. We can see that we have siblings in this photo. All the young ladies are wearing those white kind of frock dresses with the black tights, but we have a child in the middle standing on top of the chair, boy or girl. It's a boy. You wouldn't necessarily think it was a boy, but there's a couple of reasons why it's a boy. One, the dress, the frock that the boy is wearing is militaristic in style and has pleating and a belt. Young ladies typically would not have pleating or a belt, so that kind of is what set unpotty trained children, boys apart from girls. The fact that he's wearing white tights versus black tights kind of helps also. But you can see in the photo, some of the girls have bows, some of the girls with short hair do not. But again, those white frock dresses and the black tights are really what tell us this photo's taken sometime in the aughts. But the chair helps us. The photo in the upper left, we have a young lady, and you could ask yourself, am I looking at a wedding? Am I looking at a confirmation? Am I looking at a graduation? Women would typically wear white for graduation, so that would be my first clue. But you're looking for props. If it were graduation, typically she'd be holding a diploma. If it were a confirmation, she would probably be holding a Bible or a rosary, or there'd be candles behind her. I'm loving these boots, and if I can get my hand on a pair of these boots, I absolutely would. This style of boots was influenced by the uniforms that the soldiers wore during the First World War. So this tells me this photo is taken sometime after 1914. But with the jewelry, the bow, she's a young lady, so she's not old enough to be married yet. So it's not a graduation photo. Turns out it's an eighth grade graduation photo, is what this one is on the left. So we're looking for those props to try to figure that out. And then this is a picture of my grandparents. This is my Grandma Jean and my Grandpa Casey. Isn't he handsome? Doesn't he look just like Alan Ladd? But we're looking at the brownie camera that he's holding in his hand, right? When did brownie cameras come out? You look at this photo, you're like, yep, 1940s, no doubt about it. And that's true. Her white shoes, his white shoes, she's wearing open-toed shoes. We're looking at her hairstyle and the style of her dress. All of that gives away 1940s. I'm looking at the fact that my grandfather's wearing a wedding ring. So I know this photo was taken after June 26th of 1941 because that's when they got married. You look and see that they're in a field. The leaves on the trees are fully leafed out. So we're looking at summer, post June 26, 1941. They're obviously, he's probably standing up in a wedding. Okay, who got married in that time period where I could figure out when this photo was taken? And you're just using all of that information that you see to be able to identify when and where. So let's talk about professions just briefly. I mean, some of them are obvious. We see the young lady on the left is a nurse and she's wearing her nursing outfit. She also just has the glasses without, with just a chain connecting to them resting on her nose. They don't have arms. Whether it's conductors, police officers, firemen, anybody who's going to be in uniform, you can use that information to your advantage. You know, this is a conductor on a streetcar, so I'm going to try to figure out where and when that streetcar might have been in business. I'm looking for backgrounds, I'm looking for street names to try to figure that out, or I'm looking up the name of the streetcar company in the photo. On the bottom, we see that this is C.C. Heron Home Baking and Baked Beans Company. We look at this photo and we see a couple out in front of their business. Doors wide open. I'm sure my grandma would love that. Shut the door, you're letting all the cold air in. They're both wearing their business attire. She's wearing an apron, he's wearing an apron. And we look at the child, boy or girl. We've got a little girl in the photo. Again, she's got an A-line style dress on in black tights, so we know we're looking at a little girl. And then if you look at the garland in the window, I'm pretty convinced that this picture was probably taken on Christmas Day because you wouldn't have decorated until Christmas Eve or Christmas Day. And there's just the garland in the window. And then if you look past the business to the street, you can see that there's snow on the ground. So this is probably them coming out and having a photo taken on Christmas morning. But I'd be able to look up CC Heron, baked beans. I have an address, 236. I don't have a street, but I'd be able to do a Google search for that. Other things that you can see, like here in this particular photo, painting and papering. Eugene Carter's dad is owned a wallpapering business. I can look at the vehicle and kind of place that in the early teens, right? Based on the wheels, based on the style of the car or the truck in this instance. I would try to identify the church in the background if I could. Um, Here we've got, if you look at the jacket of the man in the photo on the right, it says Lockwood Dairy. You can see the milking can in the front. You can see the milking equipment in the background. You'd be able to use those to help identify the photo. Art Nickel, who I showed you earlier in the Johnson Oil photo, here's him behind bar, his favorite profession. Unfortunately, he became a victim of his own occupation and he wound up dying of cirrhosis of the liver. But here's a picture of him behind the bar, right? Making drinks with his shaker there. So again, I'm using the information that I can get from the bottles, the labels, the outfit that he's wearing to kind of ballpark an era for this. In the background, we see this is Hollis Craig in his grocery store. This is in Lincoln, Nebraska. If you were to zoom in on this photo, you would actually be able to read the labels. If you scan it high enough, read the labels of the products that he has on his shelf. But I know that this photo was most likely taken in fall because if you look at the bin on the left-hand side, he's got beets and turnips. And while, yes, you can grow beets and turnips in the spring, they're typically a fall crop. So by looking at what the fresh fruit, the fresh produce he has in the bins up front kind of gives me an idea of when this particular photo was taken. Okay, this is Eddie Gardner in both of these photos. So we see Eddie in the top, on the top right. He was a stunt pilot and trainer. He trained pilots during the First World War. He worked for the Airmail Service alongside Lindbergh at the start of the Airmail Service. So this is a photo of him with his plane and his co-pilot. The photo in front, he originally started his career as a race car driver, and apparently race cars weren't as exciting as flying planes. But if you look at these two photos, there's a lot of info here. Look at the tires on both. Right? Neither of them look particularly sturdy or safe. You look at his race car, look at how big the steering wheel is. and that it's on the wrong side. It's on the passenger side of what we would consider to be the passenger side now. We could see the two gentlemen behind them in their driving coats with their gauntlet gloves on. We can see that he's got his skull cap on and his goggles to keep the dust out of his eyes, out of the from the dirt roads. So again, just some really cool stuff, but you'd be able to place these into their time periods based on the tires, based on the clothing that they're wearing. If you look at the leather jacket and the boots that he's wearing in front of his plane. Those are, holdovers from his time in the military, very militaristic in nature. So let's talk about the military. So military photos progress just like the technology of photos progress. So when photography is invented in the late 1840s, by the time the Civil War comes about, it's still in its infancy. So you're not getting those elaborate backgrounds yet. You're not getting those fancy photographer's marks. You're just getting a lot of headshots, a lot of photos with just simple walls or simple backgrounds behind them. But I can look at these photos and I could recognize the era based on the structure of the photo, right? That, they're simple with just a simple band around the outside, whether it's blue in the one for the Union Army on the right or gold. James Burnett here on the left was in the cavalry, and you can see their uniforms clearly in both images. And then we progress further, right? We can identify First World War photos based on their doughboy hats, based on their trench coats, based on those tight wraps and the boots that they were wearing at the time of the First World War, right? We recognize the era, the style of military uniform. Same thing is true as you progress into the Second World War, Korea, and Vietnam. The photo on the right is actually U.S. Navy in Korea. This was a series of 4 photos that were taken at a photo booth in Korea. So if you look at it, that's why the photo is backwards, almost like a tintype. Tintypes were done in reverse. So if you have a tintype in your collection, they would create the image and then place it on top, almost like you're making a sandwich. And so that image is always reversed. Here I'm seeing it in real time in 1950 because this photo, you could see that U.S. Navy is backwards in the image. So if you have tintypes, you'd want to reverse them just like this. I'd want to reverse. But these are Navy uniforms in the Korean War. Look at how young these two are. And then on the left-hand side, we can see that we have a soldier. We don't know if it's First World or Second World War or Korea, but we're looking at his uniform. Again, he's got the 3 stripes for the sergeant. If you could zoom in and read the circle on his shoulder, you'd find out what unit he's in. If you're familiar with Pacific Theater or Atlantic Theater ribbons, you'd be able to identify which branch of service he was in based on you see his pin, you see his wings there. So we know he's Army Air Corps, but whether he was in the Pacific Theater or the Atlantic based on the ribbons attached underneath his uniform. So you're looking for those little features. Here's Elmer Craig. I talked about Elmer earlier. Elmer served in the First World War and the Second World War. In both, he served in the Signal Corps. So while you can't see it in the photo on the left without zooming in, that big circle on his arm is a Signal Corps patch, and you would see it on his collar. In the photo on the right, it's more plain. You can see he has 2 Signal Corps pins on his lapel. You can see that he has his first ribbon in above his pocket. And then soldiers who are drafted are their hat brim is different than soldiers who are officers. So in this particular photo, looking at the brim and the symbol on Elmer's hat, I can tell that he's an officer in the Second World War. So I would just have to investigate further to find out that he's a lieutenant in the Second World War. And it's all based on the brim of his hat that he's wearing. So those props and backgrounds I talked about, we're going to be going through our family photos and we're playing a game of matching, right? We're looking for same. So this is the same background in both photos. We can see that we have the same chair in both photos, but we have a different table in the chair on the right. Again, that little Lord Fauntleroy look where he's got the big flouncy collar, right? Again, they're both potty trained, but not old enough for long pants. They both have knickerbocker pants on. But the youngest child in the front is still wearing a gown because he's not been potty trained just yet. So I would be going through and I could see both of these were taken at Perry's studio. The logo's slightly different, but they're both taken at Perry's studio. So I would be looking to try to see if I could match up the ages on these photos based on the outfits that they're wearing and the props that they're using in the background and Perry's logo to see if I could figure out when Perry changed their logo. Here's that ubiquitous chair again. We see it all over the place. So from top left to bottom right, we have Naperville, Illinois, Aurora, Illinois, Scotland, Kankakee, and Nebraska. This chair is everywhere, all the time, everywhere. What we're going to use are what we can see besides just the chair. I apologize, my dog's howling. The family must have just left for dinner. We can see in the bottom left, again, she's wearing an outfit that has that very militaristic style epaulets and star buttons, right? So we're going to say, okay, this is probably close to the Civil War. Again, her hair's tight and pulled back. She doesn't have the fringy bangs just yet. So this photo is post-Civil War, but pre-1871. The photo from Scotland is 1864, 1866 and 1865 in the top, and then right about 1870 for the photo in the bottom. Again, tight hair, curls, very militaristic style to her gown, but that chair, again, will pop up in your photos all over the place. Here's another example, right? So these are all from the same photography studio. These first four photos are all the same family. So we can see chair, chair, tablecloth, 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 chair. So you can see they're all tied together based on the props that they're using. We can see that the photo in the bottom right isn't a tintype like the others. This one actually has, it's a carte de visite, it's a cabinet card, and it actually has the photographer's name listed on it. So here's where I get the photographer's mark on it. She's not a member of the same family. She's a different family, but same town and same studio pulls it all together. So looking at her outfit again, she's kind of starting to get those curls. You know, again, she's got what looks like the bustle in the back of her dress. So we're pulling out of Civil War era and we're moving into the 1870s, all tied together by the props in the background. So those marks are important. It's important to have them. So if you're lucky enough that you have, you know, I.B. Stanton photographer, Amsterdam, New York, or Churchill Photography Studio, Albany, New York, Giles Ground Floor Studio, Aurora, Illinois. I'm going to be looking at newspapers, city directories, Google searches, other people's family trees to see if I could figure out when these studios were in business. So I have a place and I have a time. Now I just have to look at the features to figure out the who might happen to be in that photo. But when you have a photographer that's been in business for decades, how do you figure it out? Well, you use what you know. We know that the diamond is 1895. We know that the tax stamp is 1863 to 1865. So we just have to fill in the blanks in between. As photography developed, so did that technology to make more and more elaborate prints and backgrounds. So we look at the earliest, simplest illustrations. Pratt Photographer 48 Broadway. You see it starts to get a little bit more advanced. Negatives can be preserved. And then again, a more traditional, he's got a trademark now that he's created, a logo. And we see that logo evolve over time. So the more elaborate it becomes, the more forward we come in time until, what do we notice? We go from DC Pratt, DC Pratt, DC Pratt, DC Pratt to Pratt's new photograph gallery. What happened to DC? Did he take on more family members? Did his kids take over the business? Did he die? Did they sell and somebody new took over? But what else do we notice? He's no longer at 48 Broadway. Pratt's new photography gallery is at the corner of LaSalle and Benton Streets. Neither one of those are Broadway. But wait a second. At the corner of LaSalle and Benton Streets, didn't I just see that? Giles, new ground floor studio, corner of LaSalle and Benton Streets. So either Giles sold to Pratt or Pratt sold to Giles, it would be my duty to then figure out which was the case. So I would just start looking through these resources, right? I would look through these city directories, I'd look through these newspapers and these catalogs to try to figure out when did that occur. Here's an example of that. So I have a photo at my church of the church school from 1895. On the back of this 8 by 10 photo, 5 of the children are named along with the teacher. Only 5 out of the 14 kids that are in this photo. But what I notice about this photo is that there are lilacs on the windowsill above the children. So the one identified in the middle with the white frock on, that is Margaret Rance, Madge Rance. She's listed, the teacher is listed, and a couple of the children are listed. That's all I know. At the Little White School Museum, across the county line, in Oswego at the local historical society, they have the school books, the teachers' books from the Tamarack Church School. And they have the teacher's log for the spring of 1895 when Madge Rance wrote the date on the back of that photo. And in this photo, you can see Madge Rance listed at the top. Out of all of the dates that spring, there were only 5 dates that all of these children were in class at any given time between April and May. And what do I know about lilacs? I know that lilacs typically bloom um, the first or second week of May, depending on how warm of a season it's been. So I can tell you that this photo that I just showed you was taken in one of those last 2 weeks because lilacs wouldn't have bloomed any earlier than that. So I can date this photo within 2 weeks or 3 weeks of each other based on the date that every single one of those 14 children happened to be in class. So you're just taking the research, the information you already have about your family, and you're just putting it together with the photos that you have. So I have this photo of this young child, again, white frock dress, black pants, leans more towards boy because it's very, pleated. There's no belt though, so I can't quite say. But I'm going to look for that table. So I'm going to go through furniture catalogs and I'm going to look for when that type of photo starts to appear. I know that it's the aughts because of the white frock dress and the black tights, but I want to try to narrow it down. So I'm going to start going through furniture catalogs between 1900 and 1910 until I can find a match. This particular photo, Charles Murr Photography Studio. This is a photo of Uretta Burkett that I know was probably taken on her wedding day in 1879. The back of the photo says that the studio is at 39 Jefferson Street in Joliet. The closest city directory that I have is 1873. I don't have one for 1879, so I can't look that year up specifically. But we have a discrepancy. And why do I have a discrepancy? So, is it a street address change? City directories and towns will renumber their streets based on expansion. That's not uncommon. So could it have been because they renumbered the businesses on the street? Or could it be because of something else? In this particular case, it was because of something else. The Charles Murr Photography Studio burnt to the ground in September of 1879. All of their material was lost. They had to move to a new photography studio down the street. So I can say without a doubt that here's the reason why I have a discrepancy between the two photography studio addresses that I see on the photo I have and the city directory. City directories are a useful tool. You have access to them in Somerset County. You've got a wonderful set of collections between your 9 different libraries. You have multiple historical societies. You've got the state archives. You've got wonderful digital archival collections that are available online to you. So Fold 3 is just another example of that, where you can go in and you can look at city directories and you can look for photography studios and you can start to pinpoint down when particular studios happen to have been in business at any given time, right? You might get ads about these particular businesses. So you could use those to your advantage as well. I'm going to use other resources, right? I'm going to use the Family Search book collection. I'm going to use Internet Archive to look for um, not businesses, industry magazines and industry journals that are talking about film and photographers and photography businesses. I'm going to look in Fold 3 and Hoppy Trust for city directories and newspapers. I'm going to take advantage of the resources the Library of Congress has to look at Sanborn maps and phone books and city directories. Lots of different ways I can start to narrow some of these businesses down. And I'm going to take advantage of age progression. So we're going to go through these really quick because I don't want to keep you for too long. So here's a picture of Elmer. This is Elmer Hunter is the very first Veterans Oral History interview that I did um, a while ago. So each interview that we did, we took a photo of the interviewee. And then they typically brought along with them memorabilia, whether it was their uniforms, their discharge papers, their scrapbooks, whatever they kept at their time in the military service. So I have a picture of Elmer the day of the interview, and I have a picture of him from the U.S. Navy when he was a young man. You could see it's the same person, right? You can, look at the smirk, you can see, his little frown lines, his smile lines on the side of his face. You can see the shape of his eyes and his eyebrows, right? All of these features remain the same throughout your life. Only features that change are the length of your ears, the length of your nose, your hair might thin out a little bit, your hands and your feet get bigger. But the distance of your eyes, whether you have um, a cleft chin, whether you have a scar or, what I call hooded eyes, where, your eyebrows kind of look dark, right? Your eyes look shaded. All of that stays the same. So you're looking for those features. And I can see from these two photos that he had served in the Navy, that he was on a destroyer, right? So his job was to load the ammunition. To fire on the destroyers, right? He was wounded. He has a Purple Heart tie on. So I could look for his military record to find out how he was wounded. But here he is in his Navy uniform. And you're going to do that for other photos. So the photo in the upper left is of Janet Craig. I can see her as a young woman, and I could follow her throughout her life. So I can see her as a mother with her son and her daughter. And I can see her as a grandmother with her grandson who looks identical to his father. It's almost eerie that, it looks like the same child, but it's father and son. And again, she always wore her hair back in a bun. She had long hair her whole life. She really liked kind of, high collar outfits. But again, look at her outfit in the middle photo. High collar, white, loose bun, right? Again, in that kind of Gibson girl period in the late aughts, in the early teens. And I can slowly start to, figure out, okay, well, how old, could her son have been to have had a son himself at that same age and, go from there. So these are siblings. So in the top left, I have Alex Craig and his mother, Martha. Then I have Alex as a teenager. I have a picture of Alex and his sister, Marion. Marion has this look on her face in almost all of her photos, really kind of angry eyes, kind of glaring at you. And I can see that in so many photos of her. And I can follow these features. All Alex's life, he had crazy hair. He always had a piece of hair that was sticking straight up. And I can see that in the photo of him as like a 7 or 8 year old. I can see that in the photo of him as a teenager, and certainly in the photo with him as an infant. Same thing with Marion. I look for those eyes, right? Those piercing eyes that I can see from photo to photo to photo as she ages. The last photo of Marion taken in this photo, she's blind by this point. She can no longer see, but still that same expression. So you're looking for those similarities to help you start to identify people. If your gut says that looks like Uncle Bob, it might be, or at least somebody in Uncle Bob's family. Here's another age progression. Here's a picture of Tamarack School from 1908. Again, in the aughts, you can see the girls with their frock dresses and their black tights on. You see the young ladies with their bows in their hair. But we're going to focus on the three that are circled. So we have Janet Brown, we have Elmer Craig, who I showed you the World War photos, and then Clinton King, who we saw in the graduation photo. So Janet, no doubt. Kept that smirk her whole life, lived to be 97 years old, even in her 90s, still had that same smirk, never showed teeth. But you could see kind of the bags underneath her eyes. You could see, the shape of her eyebrows, the smirk on her face never changes. Same thing with Clinton King again. The barn doors are open, the car doors are open. His ears are very identifiable from photo to photo. Elmer, he's got what I call a caret in his eyebrow. You see how his eyebrow kind of goes up and makes like a little caret, like on your keyboard. Had that in all of his photos, all of his life. I can pick him out because his left eyebrow kind of goes up higher than the other eyebrow in any photo. And again, you're looking at the shape of their mouth, the shape of their eyes, the distance of their ears, whether or not their ears are attached or detached, if their earlobes are attached or detached. You're looking for pierced ears in girls, right? If they had them, they're not going to not have them all of a sudden. So you're looking for those little nuances in your photos as well. And it's the same thing working it backwards. So I had pictures of Allie Burnett as these are photos I had of Allie. So I have Allie with her first child. I have Allie on her wedding day with Reverend Tom Burnett. And I have a photo of Allie as a young woman before they get married. I already had these three photos, so I already knew that Allie liked frilly collars and really tight hairstyles. I came across an album that I was convinced was a family album of the Burnett's about 10 to 15 years before the pictures I had of Allie. And as I'm going through them, I'm like, well, that really does look like Allie. The same features. She would just have chubbier cheeks because, she was a young lady, so not far off from when she was seen here with the picture of her firstborn. I keep going through the album. Okay, I'm not convinced yet. Well, I had these pictures of her parents, of mom and dad, in this particular photo. As I'm flipping through this album, I come across this photo. Very, very similar. Starting to be a little convinced now. Okay, this woman again, very similar outfit, same facial structure, likes the same style of clothing. I get to these photos. These photos are had. These are Thomas's parents. This is the Burnett family, right? This is Elizabeth Burnett, and this is his dad, James Burnett. And I come across this photo in the album, and I'm sold. I'm convinced at this point that I'm looking at the exact same families. Because again, James, same kind of hooded expression, the underbeard, like the Amish style underbeard, right? You look at Elizabeth in this photo, very, very simple, hair pulled back, really long fingers, same kind of style, same kind of simplicity, same kind of demeanor. So I reached out to the owner of the album and I said, I think this is my family. And he said, okay, what proof do you have? By the time we worked through the whole album, we had about 16 different people that we felt were the same people. He said, you know what? I think you're right. I think we have the same family. And I said, this is fantastic. Can I buy the album? And he said, no, I already sold it. So that was a moment of just dropping my head onto my desk, like, oh, we just went through all of this. But he did send me scans. So I was at least able to add these photos to my collection. But keep in mind that gut instinct. If your brain says that looks like dad, it's very possible that it's dad or at least somebody in the family. Take advantage of family resemblances. My grandpa Casey and I are the only two that have dimples in the family. None of my other siblings, none of my cousins have dimples, just the two of us. So that's a trait that came down to me. The picture of Uretta that I showed you already and her mother, there's no doubt that these two are within the same family. I know that Uretta's photos, 1895 based on the top knot and the diamond shape. So I can extrapolate that the other photo is of her mother, most likely on her wedding day based on why I have it. I'm looking at Marion Craig, who I mentioned earlier, and her granddaughter, Marion. When I met her granddaughter, Marion, for the first time, I actually gasped out loud at how much she looked like her grandmother. And she smiled at me and she says, oh, I get that a lot. She said, there's actually 6 of us who are named after our grandmother. There's a whole lot of Marions in that family, but none of them look as close to their grandmother, Marion, as Marion did. who has sadly passed. But in your handout, I give you all these websites already. You don't need to write any of these down. You already have them. You already know all the wonderful things that your library system has to offer, so you don't need to necessarily copy this down, but take advantage of those digital collections that you've already made available. Don't underestimate the importance of books. Books are such an important avenue of your research, whether it's the history of photography, whether it's clothing styles, whether it's bonnets, whatever it happens to be. Take advantage of these resources that can help you start to identify your photos and ask questions. Again, look at these photos and recite this information out loud. You definitely want to make sure that you're getting everything you can out of these photos when you look at them.